Europe does not give us during World War II. There was one place that soldiers learned to fear more than any other battlefield. That place was Eastern Front. There were no quick battles there. There were no clean victories. What existed was an immense, cruel and merciless territory. A world of endless snow in winter, choking mud in spring, and fields ravaged by the fires of war. Dense forests concealed entire armies. Open steppes were transformed into killing fields. Cities were turning into smoldering ruins. And in that place, millions of men disappeared. German, Soviet, Romanian, Hungarian soldiers, young men who had names, families and dreams. Many of them marched east believing they would return home in a few months. But the Eastern Front did not forgive illusions. During the early years of the war, the conflict on that front escalated until it became the biggest land war in history. Entire divisions clashed with brutal violence. Tanks crushed trenches, artillery transformed. Entire villages into smoking craters. The sky was frequently punctuated by the sound of attack aircraft diving. On the ground, machine guns tore through the air relentlessly. And even when the guns fell silent for a few hours, the cold continued to kill. In the Russian winter, the temperature could drop to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. Breath froze in the air. Weapons jammed. Open wounds turned to pieces of ice. Soldiers awoke beside comrades who had simply frozen overnight. But there was something even more terrifying than the cold. Something that made even hardened veterans feel their stomachs sink. The siege. When the Red Army, as the enemy began to close its lines around them, the resulting formation was called Pocket or Kesselby, the Germans, a melting pot of trapped soldiers. And when that cauldron closed completely, the fate of those men was almost always sealed. Exit roads disappeared, supplies stopped arriving, radio stations broadcast desperate pleas for help. On one side, thousands of soldiers trying to survive. On the other side, Soviet divisions were closing the iron ring ever tighter. Inside the pocket, a slow descent into hell began. First came the shortage of ammunition, then came the hunger, then the cold. Horses were slaughtered for food. Pieces of stale bread were divided among several men. Wounded men piled up without enough doctors to treat them. Meanwhile, Soviet artillery continued to hammer the perimeter day after day. Some soldiers tried to hold on to hope. Others already understood the brutal truth of that front. Many sieges in the east did not end in surrender. They ended in extermination. That was why the veterans said something that the recruits took a while to understand. On the Eastern Front, the battle was not just against the enemy, it was against the cold, fighting hunger, against fear, and above all, against the certainty that if the siege were to close completely, surviving would become nearly impossible. The German advance that went too far. In the summer of 1941, when the gigantic offensive known as began Operation Barbarossa, the world witnessed something that seemed impossible. One of the largest armies ever assembled in history crossed the borders of the Soviet Union with devastating speed and force. More than 3 million soldiers advanced eastward. Thousands of tanks roared across the roads. Hundreds of planes dominated the sky. For many German soldiers, the first few months seemed like an inevitable march toward victory. Columns advanced rapidly through Soviet fields, villages and cities. Entire roads were covered with military vehicles, trucks carrying ammunition, artillery being towed by tractors, cavalry transporting supplies, and endless columns of infantry marching under the summer sun. The first battles were brutal, but swift. Large units of the Red Army were surrounded and destroyed in huge pockets. In places like Battle of Kiev and Battle of Smolensk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. For many German officers, this seemed like confirmation that the campaign would be short. They believed that the Soviet state would collapse before winter, but the territory that stretched ahead of them was immense, far larger than anything they had faced before. As the army advanced ever deeper into Eastern Front, something slowly began to change. The distances became absurd. Destroyed cities lay behind them as the troops moved eastward, ever further from Germany. Every kilometer gained meant that supply trucks had to travel greater distances to bring fuel, food, and ammunition. Soviet roads were not like those in Western Europe. Many were just dirt tracks. When it rained, they turned into rivers of thick mud. Trucks got stuck, tankers needed to be towed, entire columns were stopped for hours, sometimes for days. This phenomenon had a name that was feared by the soldiers: Rasputitsa, the mud season. Meanwhile, the Red Army was not disappearing as the Germans had hoped. New divisions continued to emerge. Men from all over the Soviet Union were sent to the front. Some had little training, others carried old weapons, but there were many of them, and they were fighting on their own land. As the months went by, the war began to change. The Germans continued to advance, but each victory seemed to cost more blood than the last. The front lines stretched for thousands of kilometers. This meant that entire divisions needed to spread out to protect gigantic flanks. And the further the army advanced, the more fragile this enormous war machine became. Trucks broke down for lack of parts, horses died of exhaustion, tanks ran out of fuel. Soldiers marched for days on end with ever-decreasing rations. Many men began to notice something unsettling. They were very far from home. Some units had advanced hundreds, even thousands of kilometers into Soviet territory. The German cities they knew now seemed to belong to another world. Ahead of them, the map showed only more steppes, more forests, and more distant cities. And on the horizon, something even more dangerous was beginning to emerge. Winter. The first cold winds began to blow across the eastern plains. The nights grew longer. The temperature began to drop. And at that moment, many German commanders began to realize a truth that few wanted to admit aloud. The army had advanced too far. The supply lines were dangerously stretched. Reservations were limited. And the enemy, far from being defeated, was reorganizing, preparing something far more devastating. Somewhere beyond the frozen horizon, the Red Army was beginning to prepare the counterattacks that would transform that seemingly victorious campaign into a brutal fight for survival. And when those counterattacks came, they wouldn't just try to push the enemy back. They would try something much worse. They would try to surround him. The Soviet counterattack. When winter finally descended upon the east, it did not arrive gently. It came as a living, cruel, and relentless force, covering everything in ice, silencing engines, jamming weapons, and testing human endurance to its limits. It was in this context that the Red Army began to change the course of the war. Until then, many German soldiers still believed they were facing a weakened, disorganized enemy on the verge of collapse. But that illusion began to fade slowly, almost imperceptibly, and then brutally. From the depths of the Soviet Union, new troops began to emerge. Entire divisions, many of them from Siberia, accustomed to extreme cold, trained to fight in temperatures that would paralyze any unprepared army. These men did not fear winter. They fought better because of him. Dressed in white camouflage uniforms, they blended into the snow. They moved silently through the frozen forests. They appeared where you least expected them and disappeared just as quickly. The first attacks began as isolated blows. Small German units were ambushed. During the night, outposts disappeared, patrols didn't return, communication lines were cut. At first, it seemed like just localized pressure, but it soon became clear that this was part of something much bigger. Along a vast front, the Red Army began launching coordinated counterattacks. Heavy artillery broke the silence of the frozen mornings, firing intense barrages that turned German positions into craters of ice and mud. Then came the tanks, emerging through the white mist, engines roaring, tracks crushing hardened snow. Soviet armored vehicles advanced without hesitation, followed by waves of infantry. And there was something different about these attacks. They weren't just trying to push the enemy back, they were targeting the flanks. The weakest flanks of the German lines, often defended by less equipped Allied troops, such as Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians, were long, exposed, and vulnerable. And it was there that the Soviets began to attack more forcefully. Within a few days, ruptures began to appear. Smaller ones first. Later they got bigger, a road captured here, a strategically placed village was seized there, and then something even more worrying. The German units began to lose contact with each other. Radios broadcast confusing messages. Officials struggled to understand what was happening. Maps ceased to reflect the reality on the ground. The once continuous front was beginning to fragment. Meanwhile, the Soviet attacks intensified. There was no break. There was no relief. During the day, artillery and frontal attacks. During the night, silent infiltrations, surprise attacks, ambushes. The cold made everything even more difficult. The engines wouldn't start. Machine guns jammed. Exhausted men could barely feel their fingers, and yet the Soviets continued to advance, slowly, methodically, closing the space. The German commanders began to notice the pattern. Two major movements were happening at the same time. On one side, Soviet forces were advancing deep along a flank. On the other side, another force was doing the same thing in the opposite direction, like two jaws closing. The objective was clear. They were trying to completely cut off the path behind the German troops, create a pocket, a siege. Inside the units, the sentiment began to change. Confidence gave way to worry. Concern gave way to fear. Soldiers began asking questions that no one wanted to answer. What if we can't back down? What if we're already surrounded? And then came the moment when these questions ceased to be mere hypotheses. Messengers arrived with alarming news. Supply columns had disappeared. Major roads were under Soviet control, and little by little, a truth began to take shape, cold and inevitable as the winter itself around them. The enemy wasn't just counterattacking, he was closing the trap. The moment when everything falls apart. At first, almost no one wanted to believe it. On a front as large as the Eastern Front, confusing news was common. Roads were lost and recovered all the time. A village captured in the morning could be recaptured at night. But during that brutal winter, something different was happening. The first signs appeared in the supply lines. Trucks that were supposed to bring food and ammunition simply didn't arrive. Supply convoys disappeared on snow-covered roads. Drivers who managed to return brought disturbing stories. Soviet tanks had been seen far behind the front lines, in places where they should never have been. Initially, many officers thought these were just isolated Soviet units that had escaped to the rear. But then the radio messages started to become increasingly alarming. A garrison in a small village reported being attacked by a Soviet armored force. Another outpost reported that the main road to the west was under enemy fire. Within minutes, a series of desperate transmissions began to echo through military radios. Contact with enemy tanks to the north. Soviet column advancing along the rear road. We requested reinforcements immediately. The commanders began to look at their maps with growing unease. Something didn't make sense. The Soviets were appearing in directions where they shouldn't be. It wasn't a typical frontal assault. It was as if enemy forces were emerging behind of the German lines. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, ordinary soldiers were beginning to notice the change, even before they understood what was happening. During a morning patrol, a group of infantrymen found something that made everyone stop in silence. On the snow-covered road, there were deep tracks from tanks, but they weren't coming from the front. They were coming from behind. A few kilometers further on, another unit found a small abandoned village that should have been safe. Houses were burned. A German truck lay wrecked in the middle of the street, and on the frozen ground were the bodies of soldiers from their own rear. They had been attacked from behind. Shortly after, the first shots began to be heard in the distance, not from the front, but from the opposite side. It was the sound of combat coming from the retreat road. Within the German positions, tension began to rise rapidly. Messengers ran between trenches. Officers shouted orders, trying to reorganize the lines. Maps were hastily updated. Then came the confirmation. A reconnaissance unit managed to cross a side road and return with the news that nobody wanted to hear. Soviet forces had captured several important crossroads. Tanks and infantry were blocking the main retreat routes to the west. In other words, the way back was disappearing. It was at that moment that the word began to circulate among the soldiers, first in whispers, then in increasingly nervous voices. Surrounded. Some men refused to believe it. They said it was impossible. The German army had won so many battles, destroyed so many enemy armies. This must be just a temporary setback. But the signs kept piling up. More. Roads fell into enemy hands. More supply lines disappeared. Further reports confirmed the Soviet presence in the rear. And then, finally, the official message reached the unit commanders. It was short, direct, and terrifying. Soviet forces had managed to break through the lines at 2 different points and were advancing rapidly to meet up behind the German troops. If they could connect, the siege would be complete. For the soldiers on the ground, in the frozen trenches and destroyed villages, this meant only one thing. The world around them was changing rapidly. What was once a front line was now transforming into something far more dangerous, a territory surrounded by enemies on all sides. And in that vast, snow-covered field, thousands of men began to understand a brutal truth. They were no longer fighting to move forward. Now they were fighting, so as not to be swallowed up by the siege that was closing around them. The pocket closes. In the hours and days that followed, the situation changed rapidly and frighteningly. What had previously seemed like a distant threat was now becoming a brutal reality for thousands of soldiers scattered across the frozen field. The Soviet forces continued their relentless advance. Coming from different directions, tanks and columns of infantry moved along snow-covered roads, passing through destroyed villages, open fields, and silent forests. The objective was clear: to find themselves behind German lines and completely encircle them. Within the German positions, tension increased by the hour. Military radios broadcast urgent messages. Officers were trying to reorganize units that were already exhausted after weeks of combat and extreme cold. But the news coming from the rear was getting worse and worse. An important road had been taken, then another one. Bridges were destroyed. Supply columns were attacked. Small groups of soldiers attempting to cross the roads reported the presence of Soviet tanks blocking the escape routes. Then, finally, what many had feared happened. Somewhere far away on the map, perhaps a small village, perhaps a forgotten crossroads in the snow, 2 large Soviet forces advancing from opposite directions finally met. When that happened, the net closed in. Thousands of German soldiers were now trapped inside a huge pocket in the middle of enemy territory. There was no longer a clear front or rear line. The enemy was in all directions. That's what the Germans called Kessel, the cauldron. Inside that cauldron were entire divisions: infantry, artillery, tank crews, truck drivers, doctors and radio operators, all trapped in the same space with fewer and fewer resources. Initially, many soldiers still did not fully grasp the gravity of the situation. They believed that the High Command would soon organize a counterattack to open an escape route. But on the ground, the reality was very different. The Soviets began to strengthen the ring around the pocket. New artillery. Positions were set up. Tanks patrolled the roads. Infantry units dug trenches and fortified strategic villages. It was as if a huge, invisible wall was being built around the surrounded troops. And then, the bombing began. Soviet artillery began to strike positions within the pocket almost constantly. Explosions broke the silence of the frozen mornings. Shrapnel tore through the air. Destroyed houses crumbled under the impacts. At night, the sky was often illuminated by the distant flashes of cannons. Inside the pocket, the confusion was enormous. Units that were once separated by miles were now crammed into an ever smaller space. Roads were littered with wrecked vehicles, dead horses, and soldiers trying to find their own units. Field hospitals began to become overcrowded. Men with serious injuries arrived on makeshift sleds or being carried by their companions. Many had burns from explosions, shrapnel embedded in their bodies, or limbs frozen by the brutal cold. The doctors worked tirelessly, often without sufficient anesthesia. Meanwhile, something even more worrying was beginning to emerge. The supply depots were running out. Trucks that were supposed to bring food and ammunition were now outside the encirclement or destroyed on some lost road in the snow. What remained inside the pocket had to be divided among thousands of men. Rations began to be reduced. A piece of stale bread, a little thin soup, sometimes just hot tea. The soldiers were still trying to maintain discipline, but the atmosphere was changing rapidly. Everyone knew they were surrounded, and everyone also knew that in Eastern Front sieges rarely ended well for those trapped inside. With each passing day, the space inside the pocket grew smaller. The enemy tightened the noose slowly, like a patient predator that knows its prey is getting weaker. And inside that frozen cauldron, thousands of men began to realize something terrible. The battle they were fighting was no longer an offensive, not even a simple defense. Now it was a desperate struggle for survival, inside a trap that was closing in more and more. The beginning of hell. In the first few days after the encirclement was closed, a fragile sense of control still existed. Officers organized defensive positions, units tried to regroup, and many soldiers clung to the hope that the siege would be temporary. But that illusion didn't last long. Reality began to impose itself slowly and brutally. The already limited supply depots began to empty rapidly. What had once been distributed as standard rations now needed to be divided, reduced, stretched to the limit. A piece of bread that once fed a man for a day now needed to last 2, sometimes 3. Lines began to form around the field kitchens. Men with tired faces, frozen beards, and sunken eyes waited silently for something warm, anything. Often what they received was just a thin, almost transparent soup made with melted snow water and leftover food. And even that was starting to run out. Ammunition also became a problem. Initially, there were still reservations, but with the constant attacks from the Red Army, every shot had to be carefully considered. Machine guns that had previously fired incessantly were now used cautiously. Soldiers were instructed to conserve bullets, to shoot only when the enemy was close enough to avoid missing. It was a different kind of combat, more tense, quieter, more desperate. Meanwhile, the wounded began to pile up. Makeshift medical posts were set up in ruined houses, abandoned barns, anywhere that offered some shelter from the biting wind. Inside, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, but everything was lacking. There was a shortage of clean bandages. There was a shortage of medicines. There was no anesthesia available. Men screamed in pain as shrapnel was removed without any relief. Others were simply laid aside, covered with blankets, waiting for treatment that might never come. And then there was the cold. The cold was not just a condition, it was a constant enemy. During the night, temperatures plummeted to extreme levels. Soldiers tried to sleep together, huddled in makeshift shelters, sharing body heat to avoid freezing. Even so, many woke up shivering violently, or didn't wake up at all. My fingers were starting to lose feeling. Feet went numb inside frozen boots. Noses and ears darkened, clear signs of frostbite. Some men needed to have parts of their bodies amputated. Others simply continued fighting, even knowing that they were slowly being consumed by the cold. The weapons suffered as well. Oil was freezing inside the mechanisms. Rifles jammed at the most critical moment. Machine guns were malfunctioning in the middle of an attack. The soldiers tried to warm the weapons with their hands, with their own bodies, breathing on the cold metal, anything to keep them functioning. And while all this was happening inside the pocket, outside, the Red Army was tightening its grip. Attacks came constantly. Sometimes they were small raids probing the defenses. Other times they were heavier offensives, with artillery clearing the way before the infantry advanced. There was no rest. During the day, explosions. During the night, isolated gunshots, screams, movement in the shadows, or I am si tornavom luxo raro. And little by little, something began to change within the men. Discipline still existed, but now it was mixed with something deeper. Extreme fatigue, constant hunger, silent fear. Some still believed that rescue would come, others were beginning to doubt, but all felt they were entering a different phase of the battle, a phase where the normal rules of war ceased to exist, where the fight for victory was no longer the goal, but simply to see what the next day will bring. It was at that moment that many soldiers understood, clearly and painfully, the true meaning of being surrounded in Eastern Front. The siege didn't kill everyone at once. He killed them little by little, taking away the food, taking away the heat, taking away hope, and turning each day into a brutal struggle for survival. Heaven becomes the only hope. As the days passed inside the pocket, the reality became increasingly clear to the soldiers trapped in that frozen cauldron. There were no more safe roads. The escape routes were in the enemy's hands. The supply lines were cut, and the Soviet siege grew tighter every day. There was only one possibility left: the sky. From that moment on, the entire hope of survival for thousands of men depended on something extremely uncertain. Transport planes attempting to reach the pocket by air. The soldiers began hearing about it through rumors circulating in the trenches and makeshift shelters. They said planes were being sent to bring food, ammunition, and medicine. They said the command believed it would be possible to keep the army alive until a rescue operation broke through the Soviet lines. For hungry, frozen, and trapped men, this news became a small flame of hope. And then one day they heard the sound. First, distant, a faint noise in the grey winter sky. Some soldiers raised their heads. Others emerged from shelters or trenches to look up. Gradually the sound grew louder, the heavy roar of engines battling the icy air. And then it appeared, an airplane, flying low over the pocket. The sight of that plane brought an immediate reaction among the men on the ground. Some raised their arms, others shouted. Many simply stood watching in silence, as if they were witnessing something miraculous. Soon, the first supply containers began to fall. Large crates attached to parachutes descended slowly from the white sky. Inside them were food, ammunition, medicine, things that now meant the difference between life and death. But even this moment of hope was fraught with danger. The Soviets knew exactly what those planes meant. As soon as the engines were heard in the sky, anti-aircraft positions began firing. Heavy machine guns and cannons aimed high, trying to hit the transports before they could drop their cargo. From the ground, the surrounded soldiers watched helplessly as the planes flew through that deadly corridor. Some managed to get through, others do not. It was not uncommon to see a plane get hit, start emitting smoke, and disappear behind a line of trees or distant hills, followed by a muffled explosion. When this happened, everyone knew that the men inside had died trying to help them. Even when supplies managed to fall into the pocket, another problem arose. Where exactly would they fall? The planes often had to drop the cargo quickly under enemy fire. This meant that the containers didn't always land near the units that needed them most. Some fell in open fields under Soviet control, others disappeared into forests or artillery craters, and when a container finally fell near starving soldiers, the result could be chaotic. Men ran through the deep snow trying to reach the crates before other units arrived. Sometimes there were shoves, shouts, even fights. Inside the boxes were things that at that moment seemed like treasures. Frozen bread, cans of meat, ammunition for rifles and machine guns, bandages and medications. Soldiers tore open the packages with hands trembling from cold and hunger. Some ate immediately, even though the food was as hard as a rock because of the ice. But the truth was cruel. Even with airplanes, the supplies were insufficient. The number of men trapped inside the pocket was enormous, and each flight managed to bring only a small fraction of what was actually needed. Many days passed without any planes appearing, either because of bad weather or because the Soviets had made the airspace even more dangerous. And in those days, the silence of the sky seemed heavier than any bombardment. The soldiers gazed at the white horizon, hoping to hear the distant sound of engines again, hoping the next plane would bring more food, more ammunition, more hope. Because at that moment, within that deadly siege in Eastern Front, the sky had become the only link to the outside world, and each plane that appeared represented something simple yet powerful, another day of survival. The Red Army tightens the siege, while the soldiers inside the pocket battled cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Outside, the Red Army executed its strategy with frightening calm. The Soviet commanders knew they had a huge advantage: time. They didn't need to attack in a hurry. The net was already closing in. Now all that was left was to squeeze it slowly. Around the pocket, Soviet forces began constructing a veritable iron wall. New defensive lines sprang up daily. Infantry dug deep trenches in the frozen snow. Machine guns were positioned on hills and ruins of destroyed villages. Anti-tank guns were buried in the hard ground, aimed at the few roads that still existed within the pocket. Tanks constantly patrolled the open areas. Any significant movement by the surrounded troops was quickly detected. The Soviets also began using their most devastating weapon, artillery. Day after day, entire batteries of cannons fired upon the positions within the pocket. The sound of the explosions became a constant part of life for the surrounded soldiers. Early in the morning, the first shot often came even before sunrise. Then another one came along, and another. Explosions shook the frozen ground. Shards of metal ripped through the air. Abandoned houses and barns used as shelters were destroyed in seconds. Entire trees were uprooted by the shockwaves. The soldiers quickly learned to throw themselves to the ground upon hearing the characteristic whistling sound of approaching projectiles. Even so, many did not have enough time to react. Each attack left new bodies scattered across the snow, and with each passing day, something even more worrying began to happen. The space inside the pocket was shrinking. Soviet forces advanced, slowly, from all directions. Small villages that had previously served as German defensive positions were taken one after another. Forests that offered shelter disappeared as the lines retreated a few kilometers. It was as if the enemy were pushing against the walls of a huge prison. The soldiers inside the siege began to realize this in a very concrete way. Roads that were once used to move troops were now under constant fire. Safe trails ceased to exist. Units that were separated by kilometers began to meet, crammed into the same space. The density of men inside the pocket was increasing. More soldiers, more injured, less space. Piles of wrecked vehicles began to accumulate on the roads. Trucks out of fuel were abandoned. Dead horses lay frozen beside broken sleds. Heavy equipment was left behind because there was simply no way to move it, and above all, fear was beginning to grow. The men realized that the enemy was getting closer and closer. Sometimes during the night it was possible to hear voices in Russian coming from positions that had previously been empty. At other times, patrols reported encountering Soviet soldiers just a few hundred meters away. The line between front and rear had practically disappeared. Everything was now a battlefront. The Red Army also began conducting short, violent attacks to test the defenses. Small groups advanced rapidly, attempting to capture isolated positions or create confusion among the defenders. Sometimes these attacks were repelled. Other times they managed to push the line a few meters into the pocket, but the main objective was not to conquer large territories all at once. It was something far more cruel. Tire out the enemy. Each attack forced the surrounded soldiers to expend more ammunition. Each bombardment destroyed more shelters. Each Soviet advance further reduced the space available for survival. It was constant, relentless pressure. Inside the pocket, the soldiers began to feel that they were being slowly crushed. They saw the maps being updated every day, and the lines marking Soviet positions were getting closer and closer to the center. Some men began to do silent calculations. If the net continued closing at this rate, how much time was left? Days? Maybe weeks? Nobody knew for sure, but everyone could feel the same thing in the icy air of that brutal winter in Eastern Front. The enemy was getting closer, and the space to survive was getting smaller and smaller. Hunger is starting to kill. At the start of the siege, hunger was merely a constant discomfort, an empty stomach, a smaller than usual meal, a persistent feeling of weakness that the soldiers tried to ignore as they continued fighting. But as the days went by, she began to transform into something far more dangerous. Inside the pocket, food supplies were rapidly dwindling. The few remaining boxes of supplies had to be divided among thousands of men. The field kitchens began distributing increasingly smaller portions. First they reduced the size of the rations, then they reduced the number of meals, and then came the time when many soldiers spent an entire day eating only a small piece of stale bread, sometimes frozen like a rock. Hunger began to change men's behavior. During the lulls between battles, many soldiers no longer talked about the war or about home. They talked about food, they talked about fresh bread, about hot soup, about roast meat. Some described meals that reminded them of their childhood. Others simply remained silent, staring into space, trying to ignore the constant pain in their stomachs. Therefore, the normal food sources disappeared completely. That's when the soldiers started looking around with different eyes. The horses. At the start of the campaign, horses were essential for transporting artillery, ammunition, and supplies. But inside the pocket, with food dwindling and the brutal cold-killing animals at night, many of these horses began to drop dead on the roads or in the snow-covered fields. When this happened, groups of soldiers would quickly approach. Knives were being drawn. Within minutes, the meat was cut into pieces and divided among the men. There was no time to cook properly. Often, the meat was just quickly heated over a small, makeshift fire. Other times it was eaten almost raw, tough and frozen. Even so, it looked like a feast. But there weren't enough horses to feed everyone. As the siege continued, food became increasingly scarce. Some soldiers began collecting leftover food from old cans. Others scraped the bottom of frozen pans, looking for anything that could be eaten. The snow was melted to make a kind of weak soup, sometimes mixed with pieces of horse meat or crumbled bread. Even with these makeshift solutions, weakness began to spread among the men. Bodies that once endured long marches and intense combat now struggled just to stay on their feet. Soldiers who once carried heavy machine guns now had difficulty even lifting their rifles. Some would faint during patrols, others simply didn't have the strength to leave the shelters. The doctors began to notice something even more worrying. The injured took much longer to recover. Without enough food, the body couldn't heal. Small wounds became serious infections. Men who might have survived under normal conditions now died slowly from extreme weakness. The cold made everything even worse. Malnourished bodies lost heat more quickly. Starving soldiers began to tremble uncontrollably during the night. Some could no longer control their muscles, such was their exhaustion. There was also the psychological impact. Constant hunger was corroding the minds of men. Concentration would disappear. Moods would change rapidly. Minor arguments between colleagues could escalate into violent fights. Some soldiers began hiding scraps of food for themselves. Others became obsessed with anything that could be eaten, even frozen animal remains found in the snow. And yet, the siege continued. The planes that brought supplies rarely managed to deliver enough. Often, days would pass without them appearing in the sky. When they finally arrived, the crates dropped from the air would quickly disappear among the nearest units. For many soldiers inside the pocket, there was nothing left. And it was at that moment that hunger ceased to be merely suffering. She began to become an invisible weapon. A weapon that killed slowly, day after day within that brutal siege in Eastern Front, not with explosions, not with gunshots, but with something much quieter, the complete exhaustion of the human body. Men who had survived bloody battles were now being defeated by something simple and cruel, the lack of food, cold as an invisible enemy. If hunger was a silent enemy, the cold was a constant killer. No Eastern Front winter was not just a season, it was a brutal force of nature, capable of destroying men, machines, and entire armies without firing a single shot. Inside the surrounded pocket, the soldiers soon realized they were fighting something they couldn't see, but could feel every second. During the day, the cold was bearable, only because the men were constantly on the move, digging positions, transporting the wounded, patrolling lines, or responding to Soviet attacks. But when night fell, everything changed. The temperature was plummeting. The wind swept across the open fields like an invisible blade, piercing through uniforms, penetrating boots, freezing the sweat that had accumulated during the day. Inside makeshift shelters, the soldiers tried to protect themselves as best they could. Many huddled together in small, ruined huts, abandoned barns, or holes dug in the frozen ground. They slept side by side, sharing each other's body warmth. Even so, the cold always found a way to get in. Breaths turned into white clouds inside the shelters. Damp blankets froze during the early morning hours. Uniforms stiffened with ice. Some soldiers woke up, trembling violently. Others would wake up with a strange sensation, a deep numbness in their hands or feet. That was the first sign of frostbite. At first, it just felt like tingling. Then came the loss of sensation. Fingers and toes were starting to turn pale, almost white. If nothing was done quickly, the skin would change color, first gray. Then it turned bluish, and finally, black. Some men realized it too late. When they removed the boots, they discovered that the feet were severely frostbitten. The pain was so intense that many screamed or fainted. In extreme cases, the only solution was to amputate toes, or even the entire foot. But the doctors had few tools, little time, and almost no medicine. Many amputations were performed quickly, under improvised conditions, with soldiers holding the patient down while he screamed in pain. Others simply didn't have the strength to keep fighting. The cold also damaged the weapons. The oil inside the mechanisms froze overnight. In the morning, soldiers tried to fire their rifles and discovered that the trigger wouldn't move. Machine guns jammed in the middle of an attack. To avoid this, many men began sleeping with their weapons inside their shelters, sometimes even inside their coats, trying to keep the metal warm with their body heat. The vehicle's engines suffered even more. Trucks simply wouldn't start in the morning. Tanks needed to be heated for hours before they could operate, when there was still enough fuel left. Because of this, many vehicles were abandoned. They lay on the roads like frozen iron skeletons, covered in snow, silently reminding us that this war was not being fought against just another army. It was a war against the environment itself. And there was something even crueler about the extreme cold. He was deceiving. Some soldiers, exhausted and hungry, began to feel a strange sensation of heat just before severe hypothermia set in. Their bodies, unable to continue fighting the loss of body temperature, collapsed. These men often simply lay down. They leaned against a tree. They were sitting in a trench, or they would settle down in the snow as if they were going to sleep. Teammates tried to wake them up, shaking their shoulders and shouting their names, but often it was already too late. As dawn approached, more frozen bodies were found scattered across the affected areas. Men who had survived battles, explosions and gunfire now lay motionless in the snow, victims of an invisible enemy that made no sound. Inside the pocket, the soldiers began to understand something terrifying. They weren't just fighting against the Red Army, they were fighting three enemies at the same time. The enemy was firing shots, the hunger that slowly destroyed the body, and the cold that patiently awaited the night. And in that brutal winter, many men began to realize that the cold was, perhaps, the most ruthless of all. The order to break the siege. After weeks living inside that frozen pocket, one thing became clear to everyone: the situation couldn't continue like this. The soldiers were exhausted, the food was almost gone, the number of injured increased every day. Meanwhile, the Red Army continued to slowly tighten the siege, pushing the lines inward, as if closing the walls of a huge trap. Inside makeshift command posts, often set up in destroyed houses or basements of bombed villages, officers analyzed maps covered in notes and scribbled lines. Each new update showed the same thing. The space inside the pocket was getting smaller. Soviet artillery was able to reach more and more positions. Internal roads were under constant fire. Units that were once separated by kilometers were now compressed into a much smaller area. And there was another, even more serious problem. The planes bringing supplies could no longer keep the army alive for much longer. Bad weather, Soviet anti-aircraft fire, and the sheer number of soldiers within the encirclement made it impossible to deliver everything that was needed. The mathematics of survival were brutal. There were too many men and not enough food. It was at this point that the commanders began to consider the only option left: break through the siege. The idea was simple in theory, but extremely dangerous in practice. At some point along the Soviet ring, there should have been a weaker area, a sector where enemy defenses weren't so dense. If a force large enough attacked there with everything it had left, it might be possible to open a temporary corridor, a corridor through which surrounded soldiers could escape. But there were many risks. The men were weak, many vehicles were destroyed or out of fuel, ammunition was limited, and above all, the enemy knew that this attempt would likely happen. Even so, there was no choice. Inside the pocket, standing still meant dying slowly from hunger, cold, or bombings. Advancing against the Soviet lines at least offered a small chance of survival. At some point, the order finally reached the units scattered throughout the siege. Messages were transmitted by radio. Messengers crossed the snow, carrying written instructions. Officers gathered their men to explain what was going to happen. The reaction was silent. Many soldiers heard the news without showing any emotion. They were too tired to celebrate or question it. But deep down, everyone understood the meaning of that order. That wasn't just an attack. It was a desperate attempt to survive. The following hours were used to prepare everything that could still be organized. Weapons were checked. The few vehicles that were still operational were gathered together. The remaining ammunition was distributed. A lot of heavy equipment had to be abandoned. Large cannons, damaged vehicles, and crates of material that couldn't be loaded were left behind. There was no more room for excess weight. Each man needed to carry only the essentials: a rifle, a few bullets, perhaps a piece of food, and the little equipment that still worked. The wounded represented yet another cruel dilemma. Some were still able to walk and would be taken along with the columns. Others were too ill to move. Doctors and comrades knew that some men simply wouldn't be able to participate in the escape. Those were silent and heavy moments. Some soldiers shook hands with wounded comrades. Others promised to return with help, promises that deep down they knew they might never be able to keep. When everything was ready, all that remained was to wait for the right moment. The attempted break-in usually happened at night. The darkness offered some protection against artillery fire and made it difficult for the Soviets to immediately notice troop movements. That night, while the icy wind blew across the snow-covered fields of Eastern Front, thousands of men began to prepare in silence. Rifles were held more tightly, helmets properly fitted. The last bits of food were divided. Some men wrote short messages on scraps of paper, quick notes for distant families in case someone found their bodies in the future. Others simply sat in silence, staring into the darkness. They knew that what was about to happen would be one of the most dangerous parts of the entire battle, because breaking a siege meant something simple and brutal. They would have to cross directly the heart of the enemy lines. The march of survival night finally fell over the enclosed pocket. The sky was heavy, covered by low clouds that hid the moon. The darkness was almost complete, broken only by small points of light in the distance, fires in destroyed villages, occasional artillery explosions, or the faint glow of signal rockets on the horizon. It was the moment chosen for the escape attempt. In the German positions scattered within the pocket, thousands of soldiers began to move almost simultaneously. There were no shouts or heroic speeches, only short orders whispered between officers and men. Time to leave. Columns began to form slowly. Infantry at the front carrying rifles and machine guns. Behind them, small groups of soldiers pulling makeshift sleds with wounded or essential equipment. A few vehicles that were still functional, trucks, half-tracks, even damaged tanks, were positioned to follow the group, but most would have to move forward, afoot. The snow was deep in many places, reaching up to their knees. Every step required effort. For men already weakened by hunger and cold, it was like walking while carrying invisible weights. Even so, they began to move forward. The idea was simple. Move silently through the darkness, reach the weakest point in the Soviet encirclement, and break through before the enemy realized what was happening. At first, everything seemed to work. The first columns advanced slowly along snow-covered roads and narrow trails between frozen trees. The men kept their distance from each other, trying to avoid making noise. The only sound was the crunch of snow being crushed under heavy boots. Some soldiers constantly looked up at the dark sky, hoping not to see the flash of Soviet rockets that could reveal their position. Others simply focused on continuing to walk, step by step, 1 kilometer, then another one. The silence of the night was heavy. Many men were so tired that they marched almost automatically, as if their bodies were functioning purely by instinct. But that march was far from simple. Soon, the first obstacles began to appear. Wrecked trucks blocked parts of the roads. Dead horses lay frozen in the snow, forcing the columns to maneuver around the stiff bodies. In some places, artillery craters turned the terrain into dangerous traps where soldiers could fall and disappear momentarily into the darkness. The wounded made everything even more difficult. Some were carried on the shoulders of their companions. Others lay on makeshift sleds, pulled by ropes, groaning in pain with each jolt. Even so, nobody wanted to leave them behind. These men had fought together, survived the same battles, faced the same brutal siege. Abandoning a comrade at that moment seemed worse than facing the enemy. It was marching continuously. At times, small Soviet patrols were nearly encountered. When this happened, the columns stopped immediately. Men threw themselves into the snow, holding their breath as shadows passed just a few meters away. The slightest noise could reveal everything, but the greatest danger was still ahead. The real challenge wasn't crossing the interior of the pocket. It was about getting to Thiering of Soviet troops that completely surrounded the area. Because somewhere in that darkness, beyond the frozen trees and snow-covered hills, lay the enemy lines, trenches, machine guns, and soldiers waiting for exactly that. As the march continued, some men began to notice something unsettling. The distant sound of engines, Soviet tanks patrolling nearby roads, and sometimes the sudden flash of an explosion briefly illuminating the horizon. It was a stark reminder that the enemy was near, very close. Even so, the columns continued to advance, because now there was no other choice. They were betting everything on that silent march through the frozen night of Eastern Front. Each step brought them closer to freedom, but also closer to the inevitable moment when they would be discovered. And when that happened, the silent march for survival would turn into something far more violent. The fire corridor. For hours, the columns continued advancing in the darkness. The soldiers were already exhausted, their feet numb inside frozen boots, their lungs burning from the icy air that entered with each breath. Many walked almost at the limit of their own strength, sustained only by the idea that perhaps they were getting closer to freedom. But then it happened. A gunshot, dry, sudden. The sound echoed through the night like a solitary clap of thunder. For a second, everything stood still. Then came the second shot. And then the third one. Someone had been seen. In a matter of seconds, the darkness was torn apart by a burst of machine gun fire. Tracer bullets sliced through the air like lines of red fire, briefly illuminating the snow and revealing the silhouettes of the advancing soldiers. The element of surprise was gone. A Soviet soldier had spotted the column, perhaps a patrol, perhaps a sentry in an advanced trench, and now the alert was spreading rapidly through enemy lines. Suddenly, the silence of the night vanished completely. Machine guns began firing from different directions. Illumination rockets were launched into the sky, exploding in white flashes that transformed the darkness into a ghostly field of shadows and snow. Now everything could be seen. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of German soldiers advancing in disorganized columns through the deep snow. The Soviets reacted immediately. Anti-tank guns opened fire. Mortars began launching explosives that fell among the men with dry crackles before exploding violently. In seconds, the silent escape attempt turned into an inferno of fire and steel. Soldiers threw themselves to the ground, trying to find any kind of cover. Some hid behind frozen trees. Others lay down inside snow-filled artillery craters. But in many parts of the terrain, there was no shelter at all. It was just an open field, illuminated by the flashes of rockets. And in that field, men began to fall. Some were hit while running, others fell without even understanding where the shot came from. Bodies fell in the snow, leaving dark stains that quickly froze in the brutal cold. Officers shouted orders, trying to reorganize the columns. Move forward, don't stop, because stopping there meant dying. The soldiers who still had strength began to run towards the Soviet positions. Some fired their rifles as they advanced. German machine guns tried to return enemy fire, creating brief moments of cover. But the enemy was prepared. Soviet trenches were fortified. Heavy machine guns swept across the terrain with continuous bursts of fire. Tanks began to appear on nearby roads, rotating their turrets and firing at columns attempting to break through the encirclement. The battle became chaotic. Men were shouting. Explosions shook the frozen ground. Bullets ricocheted off trees and abandoned vehicles. Amidst all this, some groups managed to reach the first Soviet trenches. There, the fighting became brutal and close quarters. Grenades were thrown into the positions. Soldiers jumped into the trenches, fighting hand-to-hand in the frozen snow and mud. Rifles were used as batons. Knives appeared in the hands of desperate men. It was a pure struggle for survival, without organized training, without clear lines, just men trying to break through the enemy blockade at any cost. Meanwhile, behind them, the situation was getting even worse. Columns that followed were being hit by Soviet artillery that began to rain down on the escape route. Gigantic explosions kicked up clouds of snow and frozen earth, scattering debris that tore everything apart. Some vehicles that were still accompanying the convoy were destroyed in seconds. Trucks caught fire. Sleds carrying injured people were overturned by the explosions, and yet the survivors continued to move forward, because now there was no other alternative. Behind them was the condemned pocket. Ahead, a wall of Soviet fire. Between the two of them, there was only a small chance. A chance to get through that hell. A chance to break the brutal siege in Eastern Front. But for many men that night, the corridor that should have led to freedom turned into something very different. A snow-covered death camp, where entire columns disappeared under the relentless enemy fire. The few who managed to escape. When the battle finally began to disperse into the darkness of dawn, the field behind the Soviet lines had transformed into a silent and devastating scene. The attempted breakup had come at a terrible price. The snow was marked by craters from explosions, destroyed vehicles, and bodies scattered along the trails where the columns had advanced hours before. Many men never made it through the encirclement. Others were wounded and left behind, lost in the confusion of battle. But in the midst of that chaos, some groups managed to get through. Small units that had advanced more quickly or found weaker sectors of the Soviet lines managed to break through the Iron Ring. They moved rapidly through dark fields, frozen forests and secondary roads, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the battlefield. These survivors now walked almost in silence. The adrenaline of the fight had worn off, replaced by profound exhaustion. Many of them could hardly believe they were outside the siege, but escaping didn't mean they were safe. The territory was still teeming with Soviet patrols. Tanks and infantry units continued to move through the region. Any noise could betray the presence of those small groups trying to escape. Therefore, they continued advancing. No vehicles, no reliable maps, often without knowing exactly where they were going. Some men carried wounds that had barely been treated. Arms were haphazardly bandaged, legs were bruised, and deep cuts were covered only with pieces of frozen cloth. Even so, they continued walking, because stopping in that brutal environment could mean death from hypothermia or capture. For hours, sometimes days, these groups advanced slowly through the winter-ravaged landscape. They slept only for short periods, often hidden in forests or abandoned ruins. Some encountered other survivors along the way, small groups of soldiers emerging from the snow and darkness, all with the same appearance, faces covered in ice, sunken eyes, uniforms torn and stained with blood. When they met, they rarely talked much. A simple nod of the head said it all. They knew what the other had gone through. It was marching continuously, and finally, after walking through hostile territory for a long time, some began to see signs that indicated something different. Recent German car brands, trails that seemed organized, defensive positions that did not belong to the enemy. It was a sign that they were approaching their own lines. When they finally reached the German positions outside the encirclement, the reaction was strange and silent. The sentinels were initially surprised to see those figures, emerging from the snow, men who looked like ghosts, staggering with difficulty, carrying worn weapons and with completely exhausted faces. Many of the survivors could barely speak. Some simply fell to their knees when they realized they were safe. Others simply sat in the snow, unable to continue walking. Doctors were called quickly. The injured were taken to makeshift treatment stations. Blankets were distributed, as well as small portions of hot food. But even those moments of relief carried an enormous weight, because every man who managed to escape carried with him an inescapable reminder. They knew how many had been left behind. Comrades with whom they had fought for months, friends who had marched alongside them from the beginning of the campaign, men who had faced cold, hunger and siege together. Many of those faces were now lost in the frozen field behind them, and as the survivors were led away from the front lines, a quiet feeling began to grow among them. They had achieved something extremely rare in that type of situation. Eastern Front. They had escaped a Soviet siege, but surviving didn't mean the war was over for them. In reality, it meant something much more serious. It meant that they would now forever carry the memories of that hell and of the men who never managed to escape it. The true meaning of survival. For the few men who managed to escape, the body had survived, but her mind was still trapped in that siege. In the following days, while receiving medical treatment and trying to regain their strength, many of the survivors seemed distant. They sat in silence, holding cups of hot soup with still trembling hands, staring into the void as if they were still seeing something that no one else could see. The shock took a while to wear off. Some soldiers slept for hours on end, completely exhausted. Others simply couldn't sleep. When they closed their eyes, the images returned with force. The flash of the explosions, the sound of machine guns, the cries of wounded comrades in the snow. For many of them, that night of escape would never truly end. The doctors and officers who received these survivors were used to seeing traumatized men, but those who escaped a siege in Eastern Front, they often arrived in a different state. They looked old, not just because of the cold or the hunger, but because of something deeper. the experience of having been in a place where survival depended on luck, resilience, and sheer human determination. Many of these men had entered the siege as confident soldiers, accustomed to the discipline and routine of war. They left as different people. During weeks inside the pocket, they had learned what it meant to fight without guarantees, without sufficient supplies, and without knowing if rescue would ever arrive. They had seen friends die not only in combat, but also frozen by nightfall, weakened by hunger, or destroyed by incessant bombing. They had seen strong men slowly crumble. They had seen the limits of the human body, and they had also seen something unusual, the solidarity that arises when all seems lost, soldiers dividing the last piece of bread, men carrying wounded comrades through deep snow, entire units fighting together even when they knew their chances of survival were minimal. These memories would last forever. Even long after the war, many survivors of sieges on the Eastern Front would tell stories that seemed almost impossible to believe. Stories of marches in the midst of snowstorms. Stories of battles fought with hungry and frozen men. Stories of nights when the only goal was simply to stay alive until dawn. And perhaps most difficult of all, stories of companions who never managed to escape those pockets of refuge. Because that was the harshest truth about the sieges in the East. For every man who managed to escape, there were many others who remained behind, lost in the forests, on the frozen steppes, or buried under the snow that slowly covered the battlefield. Millions of soldiers fought and died in that vast theater of war during the World War II. And among all the brutal experiences of that conflict, few were as feared as being surrounded by the Red Army. Because surviving a Soviet siege did not mean winning. It didn't mean glory. It meant something much simpler and much more human. It meant having survived one of the most brutal ordeals in the history of warfare and still being alive to tell the tale.